This is WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM. And we have with us at WZRD Professor David Stovall. He is a professor at UIC of Black Studies, Criminology, Law, and Justice. Welcome, David.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Uh, First of all, could you tell us how you started in your studies? Did you have a break? Did you have a scholarship? How were you able to uh, follow your heart? And how did you become interested in all of what you're trying to do right now?
Yeah, I actually, when I was in undergrad, I actually was in a program called the Summer Research Opportunities Program. And it was a program that was set up for undergraduates to learn about graduate school and the graduate school process. So for 2 summers in a row, I was paired with some faculty who were doing international work, historical work, and community-based work. So it allowed me to see how that operated, and it allowed me to understand all the practices and processes of graduate school. And then from there, I actually, while I was finishing up graduate school, undergrad, a friend of mine had actually entered graduate school. And we just started talking about the process or what have you, what it entails, what's included. And I was doing work, I was working at a community-based organization.
Could you tell
And I
us which
just
organization that was?
Oh, it was called the African American Community Empowerment Program. It was kind of a broad reaching program that was in Champaign, St. Louis, Detroit, Dayton. And I when we started to talk about it, I was like, okay, well, how could I get the resources from a graduate program in terms of knowledge, process, research skills, and how could I bring that back to an organization? So what happened, I entered a graduate program, and then I started to look at, well, what grouping of people were doing work that was connecting their research to community-based needs. So one of the things that I noticed in terms of my own work was the needs around housing, uh, food, and education. So, and a friend of mine, that friend who I was just telling you about, he actually had a program with a group of family members. So we were doing that. I was doing some after school tutoring. Was also doing some community youth development work. And it just allowed me to connect this idea of, if education is what is needed, then what are the terms and conditions of that education? Right. And then who in that process actually is intentional about making sure that it's not just the research, but we're asking the question, research for what? So I first started to look at, well, what is education connected to? So education is connected to housing, education is connected to food delivery systems, education is connected to living wage employment. So now, how could I contribute to the process of people improving their conditions? So not as an expert, but actually as a concerned person. So I got hired at UIC in the summer of 2000, and I was in the College of Education for 18 years. I also had a joint appointment in Black Studies since 2006. And there were a couple of things that didn't work out the way I thought they were going to in the College of Education. And the folks in criminology, law, and justice actually opened up a space for me to engage, because I had been looking at what's the relationship between school, housing, and law enforcement. So when that space opened up, I started there in 2018. But the larger questions that I've always been asking is, what is the connection between school and community? How are community members taking their own initiative to demand uh, and self-determine what is needed in educational spaces? And then how are we informed by critical race theory, and how are we informed by abolition? So as a graduate student, I actually came across critical race theory, and that became important for me because one of the tenets of critical race theory is saying we need to spend less time with abstract theorizing and more time on the ground working with people who have experienced injustice. So those were very telling and compelling moments for me to actually continue to work in that way. So now I've been looking at school, housing, education, and then concepts of abolition.
You're doing very important work. You're trying to actually find solutions for the conditions of the Black people and other marginalized people. Since the system is so entrenched and it keeps uh, these people marginalized, did you find any pushback when you were trying to seek your solutions and trying to do the research to uh, better form those solutions?
Yeah, I mean there was some pushback. Like sometimes people would say, if you do this type of work, you'll never get tenure. If you do this type of work, you won't be recognized in the various fields. And I never got into it for that. My sole purpose was, look, how can I actively contribute to the justice initiatives that people have determined that they need? And some of that pushback was around, I mean, some people were trying, I guess they were trying to say that they were being supportive of me. Some was a little more vehement, some was a little more oppositional, but I think standing on the business of saying, we know there's a problem, right? So what ways are we working to do it? And I think that was the primary motivation. But there has been opposition. But what's been interesting is that not until maybe like the last 4 years when Trump put out Executive Order 139 50 in terms of eliminating any kind of conversation about critical race theory, there hasn't been a lot of frontal opposition. It's been much more on the sidelines, much more covert, if you will. So and there always is opposition, but I haven't seen as much frontally. Now, there are national groupings of people who are vehemently opposed to what I do, but there's not a lot of interaction between them and I.
But those that are helping you along, those organizations and the individuals that you are able to bring this research to the find solutions, what are they doing and what are you doing with them?
So right now, I've been working with a group of moms who have all experienced school closings, and they have been framing school closings as a hate crime. And I think it's an important intervention because it allows us to see the devastation of school closings. And it also allows us to understand the rationale that the state uses in terms of closing schools, right? So when you hear a term like underutilization, that's always dubious to me, right? Underutilized for whom and under what terms? So this particular group of mothers, and it's kind of a coalition of organizations, and another set of researchers are working with them to document their experiences with school closings, but to use that documentation for a projection and analysis of what schools could look like in the future that are responsible and responsive to community needs. So it's one's looking at the history, but then using the history to inform what does the future work look like.
Are the principals able to use your research to get more funding? Because when they say a school is underutilized, often that boils down to not enough funding for you for better utilization. It just keeps on spiraling down.
Yeah, and it hasn't been so some principals have actually contacted me over the years about doing stuff in their particular um school, but it's been a some have used some research that really kind of questions this idea of underutilization and also has questioned funding formulas. And I think that's really important in this day and age, particularly in Chicago, because what we saw, there was a report that came out last month that talked about Chicago had seen its first growth in student population in 15 years. But there was an interesting caveat to it. Every racial ethnic group had an increase in population except Black students. So this becomes important. And what some principals, some researchers are talking about is, well, if we know that schools that serve Black students, primarily on the South and West sides, are becoming underpopulated, what can we do in terms of teaming up with communities to figure out viable solutions? Because what used to be done was it was a top-down solution. They imposed it on a school, and then all this harm was done. But what people are using the research to say is, well, if we actually think about what would it mean to develop a sustainable community school, then we can actually have a formula to rethink schools that may be underpopulated. So there is a program with about 30 schools called the Sustainable Community Schools Program that really becomes important because it's shared funding between a network of schools. So you don't have these schools trying to cannibalize each other because they're all trying to get funding, but instead you got a broader pool of funding that's spread across schools that actually allows the school to identify their areas of need.
Are they able to scale those needs so that maybe they could get what they need and plus lower the cost?
Yeah, I think in the first, so right now it's going on, it's maybe about its eighth year. And what we're seeing is they've been able to address some of the needs. And what I like about the program is they don't necessarily think about it as something that's scalable, but something that's responsive. Because a lot of times in scalability, the idea is you can use a large plot of resources to do certain things across certain schools. But oftentimes with the scalability, the things that work in one school may not be the need in the other. So I think it really becomes important to have a process where you can determine the need and now use the funds and resources to address the need in opposed to scalability. Because a lot of times, I think that's the biggest problem with scalability. You may think that one thing could work in one space, but it may not work in another.
Right. What about the Black families? Are they the same number of Black families? Do you know in those areas where there are fewer Black students?
There's been depending on the community, there's been some really drastic changes. So some communities have lost young people, like literally, they no longer have young people, or the populations of young people, school age young people, have decreased. Some other communities actually that have a different income bracket, they have begun to send their children to uh, private or charter schools. So it's a mix. In other communities, to your point, families have stayed. So we're looking at all of these layers, right? Where there has been a shift, where there's been a loss of students, and where people have stayed. So you're talking about a number of different layers in opposed to just a wholesale shift. But I think it's important to look at those layers, particularly when you talk about the south and west sides of the city, because depending on where you're talking about, those places could also be experiencing gentrification, meaning that certain families have been pushed out, new families have come in, and it's made it more unattainable to live there because now housing prices are higher.
With all these different layers, how do you determine which layer to address first, and so that you could be able to help these communities because every community is different and there are so many layers. So how would you go about helping these communities?
I think that is critical for us and people who do community-based research. I think one of the things that we often miss is how do we now engage communities to figure out the need? Because a lot of times in research communities, the assumption is that because there's this expertise, we can just map this expertise onto the community, but they haven't asked for that. So now how do we determine the way to determine that need is to actually go out and talk to people, right? And I think this, like organizers do this well, right? So what does it mean to talk to people in a schoolhouse? What does it mean to talk to people in a church? What does it mean to talk to people in a laundromat, right? What are the things that folks need? And now when you have that mechanism, you are demonstrating a level of accountability because now what you're saying to people is if we have this particular need, now here's how we can mobilize resources to address that need.
So if we were to go into the communities and invite the parents and community members to the meetings, what should we ask them so that we could gauge the needs?
One of the things that's critically important in that process is to recognize the level of distrust, right? I mean, I think a lot of times people think about that as something that you don't want to do. But I think it's important to start with that, right? I mean, I think it's important to say, look, as members of the research community, as members of the school district, there's not a lot of trust here, right? And what we can put forward is saying, here is the mechanism by which to hold us to account. So if we need to have these meetings recorded, if we need to have notes taken, if those notes need to be shared, if there are questions about those notes, I think that level of accountability is the most important, right? So when you're talking to people, you now have to figure out what are those levels of distrust and why are people distrustful and not to get offended by that, right? That's a historical relationship in many communities. So now we got to say, all right, if there is distrust, then here are the ways that we will be accountable and you can hold us to that, right? I think that really becomes important when you start to talk to people, right? Because that, and you have to demonstrate that, right? It just can't be in word, right? So like when you say it, the next meeting, you got to have those notes ready. Right? You got to have the you got to send that stuff out to people. You got to get emails. You have to make sure that folks have what it is that you say you're going to do, right? And I think that is an important space because a lot of times uneven power relationships wrongly assume trust, right? And I think that's a tragic mistake, right? So in interrupting that, we just say, all right, here are the ways in the beginning that we are accountable to you all. Here are the ways that you keep us grounded based on what we say we were going to do. I think that's um, critical in any community-driven process.
What about the who we see in the Chicago Public Schools, Pedro Martinez's plan and the Chicago School Board? How are they or are they at all applying your insight into how they want to address problems in the school system?
Yeah, I think there are certain elements that are trying to, but I also think that the dominant narrative of budget becomes the breaking point, right? So now when you talk about, so there's factions of people on the inside in the mayor's office, there's factions of people in the Board of Education, there are factions of folks in the Chicago Teachers Union, there's factions of folks on the current board who have a justice orientation, right? Who will say to people, look, we have to think about who is this affecting, how is it affecting them, and now what will we do given their articulated needs. And I think those factions in all four of those spaces that I named, I don't think they have a way to communicate with each other currently. And I think therein lie a problem, right? Because there are people who know, and this is always a mentor of mine always would say this. He would say, people know what to do, but there's always the lack of political will, right? So like folks know very well what to do. The issue is to what extent can they get in conversation with each other about what's possible? And I think the various the fractionalization or the fracturing, I should say, of this current moment disallows that. But there are folks, like I can name folks on the inside of the mayor's office, in on the in the Board of Education, in CTU, and on the current board who know very clearly and have worked in processes to actually get community to build community accountability. But again, I think we're in a moment where it is extremely challenging for those people to talk to each other.
It seems as if earlier you mentioned that if in order to engage the community, we have to engage them to gauge their trust and how to overcome that distrust. It seems as if these factions, if they really wanted to address what they see is needs to be done, they have to talk with each other and then hold themselves accountable to the other factions. So that if all the factions were to be able to hold one another accountable to the other factions, then they'll start talking.
Yep. I mean, it's relationship building, right? And not in this kind of hokey sense, but real relationship building says, look, here's where we come together and agree. Here's some spaces that we part. What can we do knowing what's best for the families that we are working with, right? And that it changes things up sometimes when people think about that as voter contingencies, right? Because when you think about them as voter contingencies, now you just gravitate towards the financial resources, right? We ignore the human resource. We ignore the people who may not have a lot of money, right? We ignore the people who are marginalized. But to your earlier point, it's an entirely different process when you say, well, let's start with the people who have been marginalized. And now, if we believe that they have solutions to their issues, how are we in relationship with them? And then how are we in relationship with folks who are saying the same thing, but may not be talking to each other, but may be talking past each other? And I think that, exactly to your point, it takes being in relationship with folks to understand where the points of convergence are, and then where do people diverge, right? And I think those are really important, and that can also lead, if we're not careful, to heavy fracturing in terms of people not engaging with folks because of past histories or the people that they're affiliated with. So it's a simple proposition on the ground. It's a much more challenging proposition to do in real time with the people that you care about.
Totally. We could see that Pedro Martinez, they want to fire him, and then each of them have their plans, and they're not talking with each other. I don't know how much they talk with the community. It's such a, it's very hard to do, but there there is the chance if they start really dedicating themselves to building the relationships with different factions and with the community better, is what you're saying, right?
Yeah, and I think there's actually some real opportunity to do that. So there's now, if you think about the 21 members of the school board, about 7 or 8 of them come from real grassroots community-based organizing.
Mhm.
And I think that's a really important space because they don't have this uh strategy around trying to get next to power, but their thing is, I come here as representative of a grouping of people who have a certain set of needs and wants in relationship to education, and we can work with folks to get those needs met. And I think that is important. And that grouping of people, politically, a lot of times people will that caucus together and then figure out strategies. And I think that will be important in the next days, weeks, months, years of this new board configuration, because this budget thing isn't going away, and it's going to take some rethinking of the distribution of resources when you start to talk about students that have historically been marginalized.
If we step back a little bit, what you've discussed up to here is we see budget shortfalls all over the place, and it seems as if it's just those that distrust and relationships that are not being built. It's hard to begin in earnest.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, this is a this is a moment, and it's interesting in the state of Illinois. This is a moment that we've seen that's had some redress at the state level, right? So Pritzker did something very interesting in his first term, but he paid some bills in Illinois that hadn't been paid in 40 years. So that idea of getting Illinois Illinois at one time, I think under Round, Illinois' bond rating was actually at an F. And to get him up to I think he's got Illinois' bonds up to B plus A, maybe. And I think there's some lessons there, but there's also the calculus of the state of Illinois. So now, you have your guests on the show have talked about this quite a bit. Illinois is now becoming much more of a purple state than it is a blue state. And there's always this pitting of Chicago against the rest of the state. So the group of legislators who just say, look, if it's from Chicago, we are not doing it, right? Just to spite Chicago. And I think that particular calculus becomes important historically in terms of securing resources for the district. And this has been an issue. So it's not, I don't fault Mayor Johnson in this way, because this is an inherited issue, right? This is a 50-year inherited issue. So now what they have to do is figure out collective strategies by which to approach the state to address funding in Chicago and other marginalized districts, because there are rural districts, suburban districts that are also marginalized. So I think this really becomes the moment by which to do that. Now, I feel as if Pritzker's team is willing to do that, but it seems like they will only do it if for under a certain set of terms and conditions. Now, I don't know what those terms and conditions are, but it seems that's what I'm reading from the tension between the state and then the Board of Ed and CTU.
The content of the CPS curriculum. Wasn't it before they students had to pass the Constitution test, and everything is kind of being watered down? And do the kids have enough education to better themselves to step into your shoes? Let's say, do they have enough support?
Right. And it's a good question because some do, right? And this is always the variance in school districts, right? Where you have some high performing schools, schools that actually are responsive to community needs, schools that get students what they want. The issue becomes, to what extent does that happen in historically marginalized communities? And it's not so much a broad-based curricular issue as much as it is allowing a specific schoolhouse to assess their needs. So once they assess the need, then they can say, okay, here's what we're doing. And we're doing this because here's what we've located. Here's what families are saying to us. Here's how students are responding to certain things. And now we can do that. Now, curriculum is always an issue that kind of either opens up or closes possibilities. So now the question is always, to what extent do we have things that will open up possibilities? What allows students to ask more questions of their reality? Because if you're asking questions, now you can circle right back and say, well, here's what people are doing to address those questions that we've asked. So I think that really becomes important in terms of that variance. And when those who have historically had the least are getting even less, now we have to actually think about different ways to address that. And I think that's where curriculum can come in to open things up and also allow us to assess need, because this is always a question of large school districts in terms of them positioning themselves as saying certain students are valuable and then others are disposable. And I think that's the question that community members are really pushing back on and saying, you have considered us disposable and we know that we are not. And because we are not, here's what we're doing. And I think when you have recognition of that, the work you do is different. And the way you do that work is different. And that becomes a way to interrupt that narrative of disposability, because that's unfortunately a very prominent narrative, not just in Chicago, but in many cities across the country.
It seems as if there are some students, probably you as well when you were younger, that have initiative. Is that initiative, was it, did you have mentors? Were you lucky? How is it that I've seen students, I'm in a local school council, and I see some students that really have initiative. How do we uh, uh, teach initiative? How does initiative grow so that they people could actually uh, take their lives back into their own hands?
Yeah, and I think really supporting folks in that issue, right? Because a lot of times, so if I think back on my educational trajectory or what have you, I think back to the people who were supporting me asking questions. So now, and it's not about the older person, the teacher or facilitator having the answer, right? It's really around saying, okay, if this is the question, now how do we go deeper into that inquiry, right? How do we make sense of this in real time? And then people who were in relationship with me, right? People who were asking questions and saying, okay, are things all right? All right. How are you feeling? And now, based on that, what is possible, right? And now And that's something that is constantly measured, right? You are constantly in that space. And when you talk about people being able to self-determine, they have to be able to see someone who lives like that, right? They have to be able to see the opportunity to self-determine and change conditions. And I think when you start with that, that brings out a lot more possibility with young folks. Because, I mean, a lot of times you're up against an entire world and society that says you can't, right? So when somebody says you can, you don't necessarily believe them at first, right? So now you have to be in relationship with them to actually demonstrate the possibilities. And I think that really becomes important, because now a lot of those relationships are harder to develop for the myriad of reasons. But other policies even make it harder to develop those particular relationships, especially when you talk about the elimination of particular content in schools. So I think it's really around, how do we set up moments and opportunities to be in relationship with folks? And then what supports do we have, right? So young people often talk about, to what extent are they supported, right? Or in their language, right? How do I feel seen, right? So what demonstrates you being seen? What demonstrates you being supported? And then now, how do you do that work in ways that is consistent, right? That you are constantly trying to build on. I think that's really important in this day and age when you talk about young people making determinations on their own lives without being interrupted or curtailed by a system that has declared them disposable.
I think that Mayor Johnson, I heard that he wanted to eliminate homework and not give students Fs. I think he wanted, he was on that track. He did not want students to be disposable, but just doing that doesn't seem to be enough.
Yeah, and it's a lot of people have all these kind of understandings about what works, and it's interesting. So if you think about the example of homework, there's this thing around busy work, and there's this thing around meaningful work, right? So you can have busy work. So I am not a fan at all of busy work, right? Just this stuff to fill out, right? It makes no sense. But what is meaningful work for young folks, right? So now, how do you develop the meaningful work? And now, where do they do that meaningful work, right? So it's a little bit at school, is it a little bit in the library, is it a little bit at home? So now we have to ask that question around, what's meaningful work, right? And that way you actually engage in a different process. And there's a school here in Chicago called Young Women's Leadership Academy. And what's interesting about them is that they don't have uh, grades in the traditional sense. So if a young person is struggling, they get a determination that they refer to as not yet. And what they do in that space is say, okay, if the person isn't getting this concept, what are we now doing to develop their capacity and skill to actually get an understanding and application of whatever it is that we're trying to teach? And I think that's a much more effective way to assess where students are, in opposed to this kind of punitive system that says, okay, if you got an F, there's no hope, you can't come back to it, you can't do it over, you can't uh engage in. And we know that life doesn't work that way. So that thing around being able to think about different ways of assessing and engaging uh work and meaningful work over busy work. And I definitely uh see where students get a bunch of busy work that is not meaningful. So now, how do we develop a way to rethink that, because the other side of that is people can say, okay, if it's meaningful work, then let's crowd them and give them a bunch to do at home. And that doesn't work either. Right. So it's this thing around, because now you pressurize it. So now we have to think about what are the ways that allow students to engage in meaningful work, right? And meaningful meaning connected to their lives, connected to their understandings, connected to the questions that they're asking.
That sounds a lot like what they do at the Cambridge with their students.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They kind of,
Yep.
don't the students kind of form their curriculum, what they want to study, and then read the books and then discuss with the professors, and that's mainly it, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and that's a way, that's one way to do it, right? So in terms of you build out a curriculum based on need or inquiry, I should say. There could be another way where you build out a curriculum based on interest, which is part of the inquiry, right? But you might be interested in something. And then folks say, well, let's put you in contact with somebody who actually does this, right? So I think those practices and processes are important and much more reflective of learning, right? Because a lot of times school will think of learning as linear. And we know that learning is not linear, right? Students have different learning styles, students have different perceptions. So now, how do we use those learning styles and perceptions to now support what it is that they're trying to do? I think that's a very um it's a different approach than that kind of linear thinking, but it also allows people to see possibility, because I think that's the thing in this current moment, right? Our idea of possibility is getting cut shorter and shorter. So now what are the efforts that we do to build it out?
The homelessness problem and housing, and the way it relates to education. Uh, how do we address it? You've spoken, discussed it, so far, but are we able to address these problems
Right.
by addressing education better?
Yeah, I think when we start to think about the connections between housing and education, it allows for us to think about, again, some possibilities. And I think when we start to talk about how housing is intimately connected to education, and I always use this example with my students, the National Realtors Association always talks about the number one determinant for a family purchasing a home is the school it's in proximity to. So now, if we think about that particular relationship, and in Chicago, we've really moved away from the concept of the neighborhood school. And the group of moms that I told you about earlier, they talk about community schools can be deeply important if they are responsive to community needs. And as I start to think about a lot of places across the city, when we talk about housing and people who may be housing insecure, what would it mean? And this is just an example. If you have a school that's open, they open up a little bit earlier and they close a little bit later. After the school hours, you have community agencies, direct service organizations that work actually in the school, that actually have the school as a site. And I've actually seen this done in a couple of spaces where, you had I remember one school, one of the parents was like a tax accountant, and he knew all of these kind of pro bono tax services so folks could come and be in a space. There was another organization that donated snacks and food after school. There was another organization that actually referred you to spaces if you were housing insecure, right? So now it's around lining up those resources because we know what families are facing. And then if you think about legislatively what it means in terms of affordable housing, now you can begin to think about the strategies of the school and how and housing strengthening each other. So now this, and it changes up how we even think about community safety, right? So now if you have a space that people know they can go to get needs addressed, there's the greater opportunity that they will use it now. And if there are community members that run that space, then they have a pulse around what the actual needs are and getting people into the various modes and streams on pathways, I should say, to access those resources. So I think at the small scale, that becomes important in terms of thinking about how housing and education can enforce each other and strengthen each other. And I think again, this is an issue of political will, because now in the US, we talk about these housing shortages, but the other thing that's really interesting to me is we have all these vacancies, right? But the vacancies aren't filled because the housing cost is so high, right? So it's always these contradictions. And I think there are ways to rethink that to get folks what they need. But in my own work, I'm always thinking about how education and housing can strengthen each other because they're so connected, right? And that idea of a community school can now support families who may be housing insecure.
Yeah, if that were the case, that it would change the image of the schools from being a school to actually being a community center where people could go to get help, and then
Exactly.
the school becomes so much more important, and the estimation of the school might change for students and parents alike.
Exactly.
Mm. Right now, at the Gale Community Academy where I am, community members are using the space for meetings, but not for outreach yet. But it's a start, and that's such an excellent suggestion. Have you had schools that were able to start doing that? If and what happened if yes?
Yeah. So there actually, I know of a number of schools that were doing it. It's always interesting because a lot of that work was short lived. Like the first place I saw it being done was a place called Spencer Elementary on the west side. And what was really interesting about Spencer was they opened up at about 6, had breakfast for the young folks, stayed up until about 8. And there was an organization called Community Organizing and Family Issues who had located all of these different kind of spaces for them to for families to utilize. So they had a adult education program. I think it was adult education GED. They had a food program where they actually were serving meals, I think a couple of times a week for families. They had somebody doing tax services. So, all of these things. And that one was short-lived, unfortunately. I guess the funding that they had secured to do it ran out. And then, I hear of stories. I remember I had a student who taught at Moose Elementary over on California, right off of North Avenue. And they actually had a dentist that had a practice in the building. So they would do free practice or what have you. The YMCA has teamed up with a number of schools to do recreation and some services in some schools. I just saw they got some of that happening at Orr High School. So there are these spaces. And then the Community Sustainable Schools Initiative, the Sustainable Community Schools Initiative, they have a couple of schools that have partnered with local organizations to provide some direct service to families. So we're starting to see this, and like what you just talked about at Gale, that is another way to think about how to expand what folks are already doing, right? So if you know that it's already being used as community meetings, that's just a conversation with the principal saying, okay, we want to do this for families, and them just saying, okay, no problem, have at it. But that, I think, those are the examples that I think about, but often, because so much is tied to funding, they can be short-lived. And that's why something like the Sustainable Community Schools Initiative becomes so important, because it's thinking about the ways to sustain that effort and not have it to be totally dependent on a funding stream.
They have the Sustainable Schools program. Are they also talking with the community, like you said, assessing their needs and trying to dismantle any distrust?
Right? It's built into the process,
Mm.
right? So to be a sustainable community school, you have to have relationships with local community members, community organizations, and you have to demonstrate, you have to show how those relationships are actualized and activated in your respective school.
You have to lead by example. But it's it's hard to like start in the beginning too.
Yep.
What about reparations? How could does reparations help in any way in all of this?
Without question, because we're now thinking about it, and I really appreciate the folks who have been doing the work around reparations and really understanding a structure. What is a structural debt, right? And now, if you're thinking about a structural debt, how is a structural debt repaid, right? So, what are the mechanisms that allow you to pay a structural debt that can be proven historically, right? Because I think a lot of times when people hear reparations, they just think about somebody cutting a check. But what people have talked about is, what we're talking about is a structural, we're addressing structural debt. And now, if communities are allowed reparations, it's not this kind of individual payment as much as saying, well, here are the spaces that people have been denied access to, and here's how we will provide that access by way of these resources. And I think that really becomes important, because even some of your larger reparations collective. So if you think about Evanston, it's still kind of individualized in terms of a family that can show that they have been discriminated against or what have you. But when you talk about a structural debt, you say, well, look, this particular school has been marginalized and denied resources in these ways. Here's what we're going to do, right? And I think that's a different way to understand the same problem, right? To say that there has been historical inequity, there's been a marginalization, there's been an explicit refusal of access to these particular resources. And now here's what we will do to ensure that that access exists.
Is there any way to build education about this? Because it seems as if a lot of there's erasure and students are not learning about that structural debt. That's a it seems as if that's a big element for the community and students to understand.
Yeah, I think there's quite a bit of resources out there uh, that now allow people to understand the issue of reparations and structural debt, right? And I think there's actually an example, actually in education, uh uh the um and in thinking about education and the structural debt. And there's Bettina Love just completed a book a couple years ago called uh Punished for Dreaming, right? And it's how school reform harms Black children and how we heal, right? And one of the arguments that she makes is, when we think about the structural debt owed to people, now what would be the forms of payment, right? And Gloria Ladson Billings talks about, we're no longer talking about a quote unquote achievement gap, but we're actually talking about an educational debt, right? So now when we look at, and the debt just being fees not paid for services rendered, right? So that thing around, so what have Black people done to serve this space without proper compensation? So now, if you think about it in that way, what is the debt? And the question I'm always asking my students, what is the debt owed to students who have been marginalized and declared disposable, right? And if we understand that that is a structural problem, then we now think about what is the redistribution.
Will we be able to start conversations with the community too about this structural debt and gauge them about what they need? Because oftentimes I think that they really don't understand what they need, and they might not understand the structural debt either.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I often think about, a lot of times it may not be that people don't understand it. They may have different language to describe it, right? So that thing around, so I always think about a good friend of mine when she explained to me what neoliberalism was, right? This idea that the market is the best arbiter of everything that people need. And I was like, well, people in marginalized spaces understand neoliberalism very clearly. They may not call it that, but they understand the concept of this idea of them being pushed and pulled and regulated in all the different ways and then being blamed for not having resources. They understand that clearly, but they may not have the language, right? So this thing around when people just step back and say, well, wait, this has always been a problem in our particular community. And then when we work to build out an answer, we get hit harder with things that further regulate us, right? So now, what is it that we need, right? So that's us being us being limited from doing the things that we need. That's the barrier, hence the debt. So now, what should be repaid given our particular struggles to self-determine, right? And I think people have good understandings. I really like what folks are doing in a place in Jackson, Mississippi. There's the collective called Cooperation Jackson, and they're asking that very explicit question, right? What have we been held back from? What do we need? And then what are the ways that that is repaid? And they've uncovered some really interesting things historically around the city of Jackson, right? In terms of one example that I often use with my students is the city of Jackson is not allowed to collect its own taxes. The taxes collected in Jackson, Mississippi go to Hinds County in opposed to the city municipality. And that was a Reconstruction era backlash from Black people owning property and being able to vote. The white residents wanted to make sure that they could not collectivize that particular set of resources. So because they didn't want them to collectivize it, they made sure that they wouldn't go to the city of Jackson, but instead was spread out to the county where there were more white residents, right? So, I mean, just do like devious acts like this, right? In terms of really putting that into conversation. And Kali Akuno, one of the co-founders of Cooperation Jackson, he often says, look, you don't have to tell people in Mississippi that they're oppressed, right? They understand that very clearly. So now, what are the things that we do understanding that to be true? So I think it's not so much that people may not know, they may just have different descriptors around the same thing.
Well, David Stovall, professor at UIC of Black Studies, Criminology, Law and Justice, thank you so much for joining us on WZRD. If our listeners want to learn more about your work, where should they go?
They can go to uic.edu. They can look at the Department of Black Studies. My information comes up on the faculty page. They can also look at the Department of Criminology, Law, and Justice, and my information comes up on that page.
Are you tenured?
Yes.
Good for you.
Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you so much. Happy holidays, and thank you so much for your work.
You too, and thank you so much for having me. I'm glad we were able to get time to talk.
Yes, thank you.